All right, so before we go adding in the new frictions, I'm actually going to change all of the seals on the shafts. So like these ring seals here, there's a couple O-rings inside this sprag and helical gear assembly here. So now it's time to take the seal out of the pump end here and replace this lip seal. Now I apologize for not doing this on camera. I pulled this seal out off camera, but I will show you how I did it. You take your pump housing with the gear and the outside race for the gear removed, and then you take a chisel such as this, and you go in here on an angle and smack as much of the lip seal as you can carefully. Just tap, 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 and it will, see, I smacked it here. Drive it in on an angle like that, and it will pull this out. It is not pressed in there very hard. You're going to want to set this on an open bottom so that the seal can pop out. I just used the open end of a vise. And then to put the new seal in, you should be able to press it down part way just with your fingers without a hammer. And then what I'm going to do to protect this new seal is I'm actually going to drive it in with the assistance of the old seal. You are good. You don't want to drive it all the way down. You want to drive it in just enough for the top ridge to completely seat. We're going to be putting a new O-ring on the outside of the pump as well. When putting the two gears back in, you want the outer gear here, the outer race, the dot to face up. On the bottom of here is a chamfer. On the bottom of this gear right here, you want that chamfer to be on the bottom. So dot up, chamfer on the bottom. Alright guys, the rear seal has been removed. Again, I apologize for not doing it on camera. I really wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but I ended up getting it out. My trick for getting it out is to use a big long screwdriver like this. Go up underneath the seal, pry against the edge here, and then whack this with a rubber mallet or something, and it will drive the edge of that seal out. These seals are not pressed in there that tightly. I mean, they're in there tight, obviously, but not so hard that you have to use a press to get them out. So. Before installing the new clutches, since they come dry, I'm actually going to dip each one of them in a pan of fresh fluid. I clean the transmission pan, and I'm using this as my pre-soak pan. So we're going to soak each one of these in fluid in order to put them in here. And of course, I forgot to put in this bottom plate I mentioned earlier, so I have to do it all over again. And then on top of that, we put our top steel, make sure it's clean and got plenty of fluid on both sides. And then the last thing to go back in is our snap ring. For this drum, we have single-sided clutches again, and it looks like from the clutch pack that came out, you start with an outside tooth friction and end with an inside tooth friction. All right, I've got K1 frictions and everything all prepped and ready to go. Go ahead and put those in. All right, with this drum, we have double-sided frictions and steels in between. So just as with all, we have our plate, which sits on top of the piston, which goes in first. Then in this case, we have a steel that goes in. So we've got a steel, we've got a double-sided friction. Okay, this drum has double-sided frictions. Everything has been prepped and ready to go. I will put it in. When putting B1 back on the bell housing, you have a, it's hard to see there, but you have a locating pin here. That locating pin goes right there. So when you drop this back down, make sure that locating pin is going in the right area. Got the bell housing flipped over. B1 is on the bottom, and I ran 2 screws in here. They're not tightened yet, but I ran them in just to keep B1 in place. Once the pump is seated, it should look like this. Pay close attention, at least to this bell housing, at the position of this square part here and the overall rotational position of the pump, because it is critical that you put it back in the correct clocking position. All right, so we've got the front pump as well as B1 here fastened and torqued down to the bell housing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to mount K1 on top of it. But before we do that, just to make the installation a little bit easier, is we're going to line up all of the internal teeth to be right on top of each other. All right, we are going to put the rear shaft back together. It goes together as follows. I've already put this assembly back together, guys. It's essentially just the center sprag and helical gear assembly. It slides inside of this drum here. Goes on just like this. Be very careful when putting this back down because you have seal rings on here that need to be compressed as it goes down, as well as a bearing. So spin it back and forth like this while carefully setting it down, and you'll get past all of those seal rings. All right, and don't forget, on top of here we have a bearing that has to go back on. It goes on just like this. You've got your bottom cage, essentially. It's basically just a washer. Your bearing, and then the thick washer goes on top. You may have to assist it going down by compressing some of these shaft rings here. All right, so this is ready to go back in. We'll go ahead and put this aside until we're ready. There is a bearing in here, so make sure that this surface is wiped clean. All right, so the shaft for this drum here actually protrudes past the front lip of the bell housing here. So what we need to do in order to get that to go all the way down and get the gear that goes back on top is we need to lift the bell housing just slightly. So what I'm going to do is lift it a little bit and put a 2x4, or 2x6 in this case, under one edge. That will lift it enough in order to leave that shaft out. All right, this gear here that sits on top of here, the taller part needs to be on top. As you can see here, the tall part needs to be on top. All right, guys, so what I'm going to attempt to do here, since we've got this end of the bell housing chalked up, I'm going to put B2 and B3 clutch pack inside the housing here, and then I'm actually going to set the gear housing over top of the bell housing and then drop it down to put the rest of the bell housing bolts in. Make sure these two bolt holes here line up with where they go in the transmission case. I drove these bolts in off camera. You'll notice when putting them back in, they're a little bit hard to start into the threads. Put a little bit of pressure on it and then turn it. It will find the threads. It's got to make sure that the piston and clutch pack assembly that you put in there is sitting perfectly level with the rest of the case before those bolts will thread in. The clutch pack that sits inside of the gear case actually has double-sided frictions. I've got all the frictions prepped and ready to go, installed with the steels. Let's drop them in. Getting all of the teeth on the ID lined up helps this thing go back in a lot easier. All right, so before you put the gear case back on top of the bell housing here, make sure that both this surface here and this surface here is totally cleaned off. All right, guys, this is about an hour and a half after the last bit of footage that you saw. I finally got the two housings mated together, or sitting together. What an absolute nightmare. I mean, I'm gonna take you through all the kind of tips and tricks that I did in order to get this thing together, but you absolutely have to put this thing back together vertically. I don't care if it's like this or if like the professionals do. The professionals have it flipped 180 degrees, and then they have a tool that holds the transmission right here and right here, and so that they can assemble it upside down that way. The big problem with getting this thing to mate completely together is getting B2 and B3 back here, all of those clutch packs engaged. The problem is that the rearmost clutch pack, trying to get the housing that clutch pack sits into to get everything to line up is almost impossible, because once any friction is on that drum that inserts into that clutch pack, it has a bearing on it, so it just doesn't move until that clutch pack is engaged. So what you actually have to do is you have to take a screwdriver like this, and you have to wiggle it up and down like this, while also spinning back here with a pair of vice grips on the tail shaft. What that does is it takes pressure off and on of that rear clutch pack. While spinning it, it gets those teeth to line up. I'm going to go ahead and put the bolts back in the rear of the bell housing here. Alright guys, so I did miss one thing here, minor, when putting this back together. I forgot to put these clips back over here. These clips hold down that felt pad, if you'll remember here. I think that's for noise cancellation or something of the such. All right, we've got both sides of that lock nut locked back in place. What we're going to do now is put the valve body and pan back in. I'm just going to tip the transmission on its side to do that. I'm going to do a nice bit of cleaning on the valve body and pan sealing surfaces, because that has been sitting in dirty transmission fluid. Make sure to double check that the steel sealing surface here for your valve body is clean. A lot of dirty fluid has made its way in here. It's also a good idea to clean off the sensors here of any metallic particles or any dirty fluid that may be there as well. Make sure that the alignment here with your manual valve is in line with your gear selector there. That pin should fall right in line with this manual valve. All right, so we've got the pan clean, a new gasket on the pan. It's time to put the new torque converter in, and I think the torque converter was actually the main source of all the issues I've been having with this transmission. The inside, a couple of the frictions were worn out, but they really didn't look that bad. I probably could have gotten away with not rebuilding the inside of the transmission. I'm going to fill the torque converter with fresh fluid as much as I can before I put it back in. All right, torque converter is back in, and that is going to be it for part 2, the rebuild of the 722.6. Part 3 is going to go a little bit different than part 1 as far as how we're going to get to these top bolts here. I'm going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to attempt to put in all of these top bolts by using an extension through the transmission tunnel this way. So I'm going to get long extensions, long 3/8 extensions, and attempt to put this back in by putting these bolts in through this way rather than trying to get to them from the top. Tune in for part 3 to see how that goes. I'll see you guys next time.